Thinking out loud. Kennedy, baby. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying. So, I've been watching, I'm working on the sermon for Sunday, and I've made significant progress. So, I'm actually glad for this. So, as I was eating lunch, I decided to take a break and watch a video. Every once in a while, I watch a video to kind of figure things out. So I was watching this video by Dr. Sean McDowell. So he's Josh McDowell's son, the famed apologist. And this video is entitled LGBTQ Relationships and the Bible, a Progressive and Evangelical Dialogue. Now, this dialogue is between Sean McDowell and a guy by the name of Colby Martin, who wrote a book called Unclobbered. I think it's like people who typically run with LGBT call the Bible the clobber passages, right? So I just wanted to, I haven't talked about this stuff in a while. This is something I thought about in a while. I just had a couple of thoughts that I thought, let me just do a quick thinking out loud. Because I've heard this argument a lot, and this argument wasn't in this particular conversation, but I've heard this argument a lot as I've had many discussions on this issue. And let me just apologize first. I'm in my office. It's not really cool. First of all, don't forget about this bad boy. I'm trying to stick to right here, baby. Right there, baby. Don't forget about serial killer smiling pictures and forget all that stuff you see right there. Focus on me, all right? So I want to just have a brief discussion about this. This is just a quick thinking out loud. But this idea, I've heard this before. Many of you may have heard this. The church got slavery wrong, right? So how do we know that it hasn't gotten sexuality wrong? And usually when that argument comes up, it's primarily aimed at trying to make a case for sexuality outside of the traditional view, which is between a man and a woman. It's usually trying to make a case that there are other types of relationships, homosexual, transgender, non-binary, those things, that people can be married and glorify God. And the argument or the concern is the Christians were wrong on slavery, so they're wrong on sexuality. How do we know that we're right on sexuality? And on the face of it, it appears to be a solid argument, or at least a solid concern. But as I was watching this debate, now it was a friendly debate. It was a good discussion. I'd encourage you to look at it. It's Dr. Sean McDowell, and it's LGBTQ relationships in the Bible. As I'm watching this thing, and it's about an hour and a half long, I'm almost at the end of it, I just had a couple of thoughts. One thought is this. The Bible, here's the problem with slavery in the Bible. Here's the problem with slavery in the Bible. The issue is that the Bible actually affirms slavery. So the question is not, does the Bible affirm slavery? It's what kind of slavery does the Bible affirm? We cannot deny there are many passages that talk about slaves submit to your masters, and masters treat your slaves a particular way. And that's New Testament post-resurrection theological literature, right? So that's not doesn't mean just Jewish slaves and Jewish masters, but anyone who functions in the role of slave and master, whether they're Jewish or Gentile. The Bible does affirm the idea of slavery. The question is, what kind of slavery does the Bible affirm? That's been the issue. Now, in American history, particularly in America, I said American history, right? The kind of slavery which we know now as chattel slavery, I think anyone can make a case that the Bible does not affirm chattel slavery. It's clear in 1 Timothy about men stealing, and then it's clear in terms of the character that a master is supposed to have towards his slaves. We all know that many of the relationships that were slavery induced were masters who were very cruel, who were very mean. I mean, there's narrative after narrative of women being raped and then families being torn apart, men being killed. So, you create orphans and widows instead of protect them, as James talks about, which is true religion. We have that. The challenge with slavery is that the Bible still affirms it. So if you're reading the Bible and say you don't have a lot of theology and it's 1622 and you have a Bible, you're literate enough to read, and you read this category of slaves and masters. If you don't have training, then you recognize, okay, the Bible at least affirms the category of slave and masters. The Bible doesn't affirm the treatment of slaves and what we would call chattel slavery, but it at least affirms the category of slaves and masters. And I think even today, some people misuse that to say that oh, whether the church was slavery was okay, because no. The Bible doesn't affirm what we would call slavery that we're used to in America or in other countries, stealing people and forcing them to do labor and physically beating and hurting. The Bible speaks against that wholeheartedly, right? But it affirms the category of slavery. So when someone says, well, the Bible, Christians were wrong on slavery, then they have to be wrong on sexuality. Here's the challenge with that logic, is that Christians were wrong on what kind of slavery the Bible was talking about, but they weren't wrong on the category of slavery, that there was slavery that existed. The book of Philemon, Paul is writing to Onesimus and saying, look, right, he's writing, saying, look, he's writing about Onesimus. Look, this brother's coming back. He's a solid dude, right? So we know that that exists, that slavery existed, and the Bible affirms a particular type of slavery and the relational dynamic you're supposed to have. Here's a concern, though. When it comes to sexuality, even if the church is wrong on sexuality, the problem is they're not the same thing. Because there is, as far as we can tell, in any credible translation that we have, there really isn't a positive affirmation of any sexual relationship outside of a man and a woman, right? Even if you go back to the Old Testament and say, look, David had concubines, Solomon had concubines, when was it ever one man and one woman? Even if someone makes that argument, the concern is that it was still a man and a woman, though, right? It was still a man and a woman. Then when you get to 1 Corinthians 6, even though Paul is saying you're with a prostitute, when you sleep with a prostitute, which is a woman, it said you become one flesh with her, right? So even when it's not a godly union, if it's a man and a woman, it's described as one flesh. Nowhere does the Bible describe any other union as one flesh except a man and a woman. So even though Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 is saying that don't do that because you have the Holy Spirit in you and you become one flesh with this woman, he's still that's the only time where, from God's perspective, a union is one flesh, when it's a man and a woman. So the issue, when the argument that the Bible, Christians were wrong on slavery, which I agree that the application of slavery was woefully misunderstood, not by all, but by many. When it comes to sexuality, the concern is Christians cannot be wrong in the sense that there's no positive affirmation for a sexual union outside of man and woman. You can't get angry at that because we're only going by what's clear. It'd be one thing if you could say, oh, there was a positive framework of sexuality, a sexual expression between two people of the same sex in the Bible. Like, we just can't find one. We can't find one at all. So a lot of times the issue is it's about love and how do we apply love to people who have these desires. That's a different thing than does the Bible clearly affirm any union. Now, some people have said that David and Jonathan is that. The challenge with that is that's such a leap that you'd have to have a 50-inch vertical. You're like Spud Webb, Duncan, to make that kind of connection, right? Because that's just not true. Because all the people that we know that David was married to or had concubines were all women. So I actually think David and Jonathan's relationship proves the opposite, that you can have deep, same sex, same gendered relationships that are not sexual and they be legitimate. Like, I think what David and Jonathan were, they were homies that loved each other, and that was that. It wasn't sexual. So I think David and Jonathan's story actually proves the opposite, that you can be in close relationship with love, affection, and respect, but it's not sexual. So the issue for me as I was watching this video was the challenge is, and this is the challenge for us, when you say that the Bible is okay with like same-sex marriage or something like that, and you want Christians to who have a traditional perspective approve of it, the challenge is there's no positive affirmation of that relationship in the Bible, right? We can't, at least with slavery, we can say there is an affirmation of the category, the word slavery. We know that people got that wrong. We know that. The problem is when it comes to sexuality, there really isn't a positive category that we can say, oh, so the logic that the church was wrong on slavery, and so how can it be, how come we know that it's right on sexuality, is that the church's view on sexuality is not a wrong application of an affirmation from the scriptures. There's no positive affirmation in the scriptures for a sexual union outside of a man and a woman, even if it's not marriage, even if it's sinful. Like I said, 1 Corinthians 6, Paul's talking about prostitution. Even if it's not the right marital union, the only positive affirmation, the one flesh nature of sex is between that. So it just makes it challenging. So I have friends that are same sex attracted. I love them. I hang with them. Some of them go to my church and we chill. We live life together. But when I hear this kind of argument, it just makes me think, wow, what are we really talking about? Because my position personally on same-sex marriage or sexuality doesn't come from a wrong application of a positive affirmation like slavery. Slavery in America was a horribly wrong application of something the Bible does affirm, slavery. And again, it was to pay off debts and things like that. We get that. But it was a wrong application. But when it comes to sexuality, there's no positive affirmation, and I'm choosing to affirm the negative. When it comes to sexuality, I'm affirming the only thing about it, which is a negative viewpoint from God's perspective. So again, I think if anyone's going to make an argument, I just think you got to make a different argument than the church got slavery wrong. So it probably got sexuality. It's probably gotten sexuality wrong. And believe me, there are people who are using that as one of the main reasons why they are affirming of sexual, gender and things and sexual nature. That's one of their main justifications. I think it's a horrible one. It's a horrible one. So anyway, I'm just thinking out loud. You don't get mad at me, but if you do, life goes on, right? Life goes on. I'm not trying to make anybody mad. I'm just genuinely trying to think about this because I just don't think that logic works. And let me say one last thing. One last thing that throws me for a loop. All right. To my non-gender, non-binary friends, right? My friends who are non-binary, sexuality is fluid. Often to make the argument that sexuality is fluid and that there's no such thing as gender. Often to make that argument, people will appeal to what's called gender dysphoria, right? People who maybe they were born with both genitals, right? Male and female genitals, both of them. And that's a very minute percentage of humanity. It has gender dysphoria, but it does exist. And many of my friends who are non-binary or just trans or whatever, that spectrum, right? That spectrum, it seems like it's always sliding, but many people will use gender dysphoria as their justification for the non-binary nature of gender and sexuality. Here's the problem that I have with that, using that gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a scientific biological fact. So people have two sets of genitals, male and female, and you're saying because there are two sets of genitals, that proves that gender and sex even are fluid. They're not binary things. Here's the challenge. You're appealing to science to say that there's no such thing as science, right? Because if you're going to use gender dysphoria, which are scientific biological facts, to say that your biological body is not really what it is, you can't really do that. Because if there's no such thing as biological sex or gender, then you can't use the gender and the biological fact of gender dysphoria, because then you're using science to disprove science. So if someone having male and female genitals, you're using the scientific biological fact, then we have to say, okay, then you also have a male or female genitalia. So let's use the biology, the science. But then you reject that and say, no, 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 no. I was assigned at birth. It doesn't really work. And so, listen, I know a lot of people struggle with this stuff, but you got to really think through. If you're really going to have this position, you got to really think through what your arguments are. And if you're really wanting people who believe what the Bible teaches to change their perspective, you got to really recognize what it is that you're talking about, because there's no positive affirmation. And many people are using science to disprove science. You can't use science when it works in your argument and then disprove it when it happened, when you have to apply it to yourself. So either gender dysphoria is a biological, scientific, evidential reality, which means then you have a biological, scientific reality in your genitalia. You can't say, oh no, look at this proves that, but then when it applies to you, it doesn't prove it. It's just, I don't know. It's just a lot of stuff that's just wild to me. And I'm not saying those people are wild. I'm just saying I think some of these arguments are not thought through that well at all. So, but what do I know? I'm just Kirk Kennedy, who dropped one of the dopest albums in a long time, and Serial Killer Smiling Pictures. Go pick that joint up right here, baby. Go pick up Serial Killers and Smiling Pictures. This is just a thought. If you're LGBTQ, don't be mad at me. But if you do, life goes on. I understand. My kids will still love me, and I'll still have some people, and I still have put out one of the dopest albums in the longest time. Go pick up Serial Killer Smiling Pictures, streaming everywhere. You should buy it and stream it. You got $10. You know you got $10. You spent $10 on lunch today. You spend more than $10 on Starbucks a couple times a week. Go pick up that album, ladies and gentlemen. All right, this is Kirk Kennedy, thinking out loud, signing off. See you. Mr. Button. Trying to press the button. Trying to do